Jenny will love me, it's all been foretold. Was not our nag to that blind parson sold? Jenny will love me, it's clear as the day. The heather bloomed early this spring on the brae. Jenny will love me, it's clear as a bell. Omens are plenty, the same story tell. Not without reason, a cat-collared white crossed over my path in the dark of the night. Jenny will love me, I'm sure of it now. Did she not smile when I gave her that cow? Soon we'll be one like two peas in a pod, envied by men but united by God. Jenny will love me, it's all been foretold. Was not our nag to that blind parson sold? Jenny will love me, it's clear as the day. The heather bloomed early this spring on the brae. Jenny will love me, it's clear as a bell. Omens are plenty, the same story tell. Not without reason, her cat-collared white crossed over my path in the dark of the night. Jenny will love me, I'm sure of it now. Did she not smile when I gave her that cow? Soon we'll be one like two peas in a pod, envied by men but united by God.
Good evening, great souls. Nice to have you with me tonight. As you've heard, Swami Kriyananda had a lighter side to him when it came to his music. And a lot of times at Ananda, he would read to us in the early days from P.G. Wodehouse. From those of you who don't know P.G. Wodehouse, he wrote around the turn of the century. And as a young man, he started out as a banker. And he realized that he could earn more money through his writings. So he began to write and sold a lot of his work. He was a playwright, wrote short stories, and he wrote in such a way, which I always appreciate. He's very absurd in my mind, extremely absurd. And his ability to get us to laugh at ourselves was what I thought, it was just his genius. And he was able to see parts of situations and bring out the humor in them that would go mostly unnoticed by most of us unless we had it pointed out to us. And he has a great way of doing that. So Swami would read to us, and of course that's the basis of life on this planet, is to find that sense of joy and fun and bring that spirit out within ourselves. So I'm going to read to you tonight The Smile That Wins from P.G. Wodehouse, and then we'll end with a couple more of Swamiji's songs Of course, you know he wrote a lot about philosophy, but as I mentioned, he actually himself started out as a young man, as a playwright. And so his music has some drama to it. Some of the things that he wrote, like some of the Shakespeare sonnets that he put to music, and this last song that you just heard, Jenny Will Love Me, all done tongue-in-cheek. And so I'll play a couple more of those at the end for you. So this is The Smile That Wins by P.G. Wodehouse. The conversation in the bar parlor of the English Rest turned to the subject of the regrettably low standard of morality prevalent among the nobility and landed gentry of Great Britain. Miss Postlethwaite, our erudite barmaid, had brought the matter up by mentioning that in the novelette which she was reading, a viscount had just thrown a family solicitor over a cliff because he'd found out his guilty secret, explained Miss Postlethwaite, polishing a glass a little severely, for she was a good woman. It was his guilty secret the solicitor had found out, so the viscount threw him over a cliff. I suppose if one did but know that that sort of thing is going on all the time. Mr. Molyneux nodded gravely. Oh, so much so, he agreed, that I believe that wherever a family solicitor is found in 2 or more pieces at the bottom of a cliff, the first thing the big four at Scotland Yard do is make a roundup of all the viscounts in the neighborhood. Baronets are worse than viscounts, said a pint stout, vehemently. I was done down by one only last month, over the sale of a cow. Well, earls are worse than baronets, insisted a whiskey sour. I could tell you something about earls. And how about OBOs, OBEs, demanded a mild and bitter. If you ask me, OBEs want watching too. Mr. Molyneux sighed. Well, the fact is, reluctant though one might be to admit it, the entire British aristocracy is seamed and honeycombed with immorality. I venture to assert that if you took a pin and jabbed it down anywhere in the pages of Debray's Peerage, you would find it piercing the name of someone who is going about the place with a conscience as tender as a sunburned neck. If anything were needed to prove my assertion, the story of my nephew Adrian Molyneux, the detective, would do it. Well, I didn't know you had a nephew who was a detective. Oh, yes. He's retired now, but at one time he was as keen an operator as anyone in the profession. After leaving Oxford and trying his hand at 1 or 2 uncongenial tasks, he'd found his niche as a member of the firm of Widgery and Boone, investigators of Abermele Street, and it was during his second year with his old established house that he met and loved Lady Millicent Shipton Bellinger, youngest daughter of the 5th Earl of Bolton. It was the adventure of the missing Sealyham that brought the young couple together. From the purely professional standpoint, my nephew, who has never ranked this among his greatest triumphs of ratiocination, but considering what it led to, he might well, I think, be justified in regarding it as the most important case of his career. What happened was that he met the animal straying in the park, deduced from the name and address on his collar that it belonged to Lady Millicent Shipton Bellinger of 18A, Upper Brook Street, and took it thither at the conclusion of his stroll and restored it. Child's play is the phrase with which you happen to allude to it. Adrian Molyneux will always airily dismiss this particular investigation, but Lady Millicent could not have displayed more admiration and enthusiasm had it been the supermassed masterpiece of detective work she favored on my nephew. She invited him into tea, consisting of buttered toast, chopped anchovy sandwiches and 2 kinds of cake, and at the conclusion of the meal they parted on terms which, even at that early stage in their acquaintance, were something warmer than those of mere friendship. Indeed, it is my belief that the girl fell in love with Adrian as instantaneously as he with her, and on him it was her radiant blonde beauty that exercised the spell. She, on her side, was fascinated, I fancy, not only by the regularity of his features, which, as is the case with all the Moliners, was considerable, but also by the fact that he was dark and thin and wore an air of inscrutable melancholy. Well, this, as a matter of fact, was due to the troublesome attacks of dyspepsia, from which he had suffered since boyhood. But to the girl it naturally seemed evidence of a great and romantic soul. Nobody, she felt, could look so grave and sad, had he not hidden depths in him. One can see the thing from her point of view. All her life she had been accustomed to brainless juveniles who eked out their meager ear-sight with monocles, and as far as conversation was concerned, were a spent force after they'd asked her if she had seen the Academy, or did she think she would prefer a glass of lemonade. The effect on her of a dark, keen-eyed man like Adrian Molyneux, who spoke well and easily of footprints, psychology, and the underworld, and must have been stupendous. At any rate, their love ripened rapidly. It could not have been 2 weeks after their first meeting when Adrian, as he was giving her lunch one day at the Senior Bloodstain, the detectives' club in Rupert Street, proposed and was accepted. And for the next 24 hours one is safe in saying that there was in the whole of London, including the outlying suburban districts, no happier private investigator than he. Next day, however, when he again met Millicent for lunch, he was disturbed to perceive on her beautiful face an emotion which his trained eye immediately recognized as anguish. "Oh, Adrian," said the girl brokenly, "the worst has happened. My father refuses to hear of our marrying, and when I told him we were engaged, he said, 'Pooh!' quite a number of times, and added that he had never heard such dashed nonsense in his life. You see, ever since my Uncle Joe's trouble in 1928, Father has had a horror of detectives." "Well, I don't think I've met your Uncle Joe." "Oh, you will have the opportunity next year. With the usual allowance for good conduct, he should be with us again about July, and, well, there is another thing." "Not another?" "Oh, yes. Do you know Sir Jasper Addleton, O.B.E., the financier? Father wants me to marry him. Isn't it awful?" "I've certainly heard more enjoyable bits of news," agreed Adrian. "This wants a good deal of careful thinking over." The process of thinking over his unfortunate situation had the effect of rendering excessively acute the pangs of Adrian Molyneux's dyspepsia. During the past 2 weeks, the ecstasy of being with Millicent and deducing that she loved him had caused a complete cessation of the attacks, and now they began again, worse than ever. At length, after a sleepless night during which he experienced all the emotions of one who has carelessly swallowed a family of scorpions, he sought a specialist. The specialist was one of those keen modern minds who disdain the outworn formula of the more conservative mass of the medical profession. He examined Adrian carefully and then sat back in his chair with the tips of his fingers touching. "Smile," he said. "Eh?" said Adrian. "Smile, Mr. Molyneux." "Did you say smile?" "That's it. Smile." "But," Adrian pointed out, "I've just lost the girl that I ever loved." "Well, that's fine," said the specialist, who was a bachelor. "Come on now, if you please, start smiling." Adrian was a little bewildered. Listen, he said, what is all this about smiling? We started, if I recollect, talking about my gastric juices. Now, in some mysterious way, we seem to have got onto the subject of smiles. How do you mean smile? I never smile. I haven't smiled since the butler tripped over the spaniel and upset the melted butter on my Aunt Elizabeth when I was a boy of 12. The specialist nodded. Precisely. And that is why your digestive organs trouble you. Dyspepsia is now recognized by the progressive element of the profession as purely mental. We do not treat it with drugs and medicines. Happiness is the only cure. Be gay, Mr. Mulliner, be cheerful, and if you can't do that at any rate, smile. The more exercise of the risible muscles is in itself beneficial. Go out now and make a point, whenever you have a spare moment, of smiling. Like this, said Adrian. Wider than that. Well, how about this? Better, said the specialist, but still not quite so elastic as one could desire. Naturally, you need practice. We must expect the muscles to work rustily for a while at their unaccustomed task. No doubt things will brighten by and by. He regarded Adrian thoughtfully. Odd, he said. A curious smile, yours, Mr. Mulliner. It reminds me a little of the Mona Lisa's. It has the same underlying note of the sardonic and the sinister. It virtually amounts to a leer. Somehow it seems to convey the suggestion that you know all. Well, fortunately, my own life is an open book for all to read, and so I was not discommoded. But I think it would be better if, for the present, you endeavored not to smile at invalids or nervous persons. Good morning, Mr. Mulliner. That will be 5 guineas, please, precisely. On Adrian's face, as he went off that afternoon to perform the duties assigned to him by his firm, there was no smile of any description. He shrank from the ordeal before him. He had been told off to guard the wedding presents at a reception at Grosvenor Square, and naturally everything to do with weddings was like a sword through his heart. His face, as he patrolled the room where the gifts were laid out, was drawn and forbidding. Hitherto, at these functions, it had always been his pride that nobody could tell that he was a detective. But today, a child could have recognized his trade. He looked like Sherlock Holmes. To the guy throng that surged about him, he paid little attention. Usually tense and alert on occasions like this, he now found his mind wandering. He mused sadly on Millicent, and suddenly the result, no doubt, of these gloomy meditations, though a glass of wedding champagne may have contributed its mite, there shot through him, starting at about the 3rd button of his neat waistcoat, a pang of dyspepsia so keen that he felt the pressing necessity of doing something about it immediately, and with a violent effort he contorted his features into a smile. And as he did so, a stout, bluff man of middle age, with red face and grey moustache, who'd been hovering near one of the tables, turned and saw him. "Egod," he muttered, paling. Sir Sutton Hartley Wesping, Bart, for the red-faced man was he, had had a pretty good afternoon. Like all baronets who attend society wedding receptions, he'd been going round the various tables since his arrival, pocketing here a fresh slice, there a jewelled egg boiler, until he had taken on about all the cargo his tonnage would warrant, and was thinking of strolling off to the pawnbrokers in the Eastern Road, when whom he did most of his business. And at the sight of Adrian's smile, he froze where he stood appalled. We have seen what the specialist thought of Adrian's smile. Even to him, a man of clear and limpid conscience, it had seemed sardonic and sinister. We can picture then the effect it must have had on Sir Sutton Hartley Wesping. At all costs he felt he was conciliate this leering man, Swiftly removing from his pockets a diamond necklace, 5 fish slices, 10 cigarette lighters, and a couple of egg boilers, he placed them on the table and came over to Adrian with a nervous little laugh. "How are you, my dear fellow?" Adrian said that he was quite well, and so indeed he was. The specialist's recipe had worked like magic. He was mildly surprised at finding himself so cordially addressed by a man whom he did not remember even having seen before, but he attributed this to the magnetic charm of his personality. "Oh, that's fine," said the baronet heartily. "That's capital. That's splendid. By the way, I fancied I saw you smile just now." "Yes," said Adrian, I did smile. "You see—" "Of course I see. Of course, my dear fellow. You detected the joke I was playing on my good hostess, and you were amused because you understood that there is no animus, no arrière-pensée behind these little practical pleasantries, nothing but good, clean fun, at which nobody would have laughed more heartily than myself, or than herself. And now, what are you doing this weekend, my dear old chap? Would you care to run down to my place in Sussex?" "Well, very kind of you," said Adrian doubtfully, but he was not quite sure that he was in the mood for such strange weekends. "Well, here's my card, then. I shall expect you on Friday. Oh, quite a small party. Lord Bolton, Sir Jasper Addleton, and a few more, just loafing about, you know, on a spot of bridge at night. Oh, splendid. Capital. Oh, see you then on Friday." And carelessly dropping another egg boiler on the table as he passed, Sir Sutton disappeared. Any doubts which Adrian might have entertained as to accepting the baronet's invitation had vanished as he heard the names of his fellow guests. It always interests a fiancé to meet his fiancée's father and his fiancée's prospective fiancé. For the first time since Millicent had told him the bad news, Adrian became almost cheerful. If he felt this baronet had taken such a tremendous fancy to him at first sight, why might it not happen that Lord Bolton would be equally drawn to him, to the extent, in fact, of overlooking his profession and welcoming him as a son-in-law? He packed on the Friday with what was to all intents and purposes a light heart. A fortunate chance at the very outset of his expedition increased Adrian's optimism. It made him feel like that fate was fighting on his side, and as he walked down the platform of Victoria Station looking for an empty compartment in the train which was to take him to his destination, he perceived a tall, aristocratic old gentleman being assisted into a first-class carriage by a man of butlerine aspect, and in the latter he recognized the servitor who had admitted him in 10A Upper Brook Street when he visited the house after solving the riddle of the missing Sealyham. Obviously, then, the white-haired, dignified passenger could be none other than Lord Bolton, and Adrian felt that if on the long train journey he failed to ingratiate himself with the old buster, he had vastly mistaken his amiability and winning fascination of manner. He leapt in accordingly as the train began to move, and the Earl, glancing up from his paper, jerked a thumb at the door. "Get out, blast you," he said. "Full up!" And as the compartment was empty but for themselves, Adrian made no move to comply with the request. Indeed, to alight now to such an extent had the train gathered speed would have been impossible. Instead, he spoke cordially. "Lord Bolton, I believe." "Oh, go to hell," said the lordship. "I fancy that we are to be fellow guests at Weeping Hall this weekend." "What of it?" "I just mentioned it." "Oh, well, since you're here, how about a little flutter?" As is customary with men of his social position, Millicent's father always traveled with a pack of cards. Being gifted by nature with considerable manual dexterity, he usually managed to do well with these on race trains. "Ever played Persian monarchs?" he asked, shuffling. "I think not," said Adrian. "Quite simple. You just bid a quid, or whatever it may be that you
can cut a higher card than the other fellow, and if you do, you win, and if you don't, you don't." Adrian said it sounded a little like blind hooky. "It is like blind hooky. Very like blind hooky. In fact, if you can play blind hooky, you can play Persian monarch." By the time they alighted at Westbing Parva, Adrian was 20 pounds on the wrong side of the ledger. The fact, however, did not prey upon his mind. On the contrary, he was well satisfied with the progress of events. Elated with his winnings, the old Earl had become positively cordial, and Adrian resolved to press his advantage home at the earliest opportunity. Arrived at Westbing Hall, accordingly, he did not delay. Shortly after the sounding of the dressing gong, he made his way to Lord Brangbolton's room and found him in his bath. "Might I have a word with you? Might I have a word with you, Lord Brangbolton?" "You can do more than that," replied the other with marked amiability. "You can help me find the soap." "Have you lost the soap?" "Yes. Had it a minute ago, and now it's gone." "Strange. Very strange. Makes a fellow think a bit that sort of thing happening. My own soap, too. Brought it with me." Adrian considered. "Tell me exactly what occurred, in your own words, and tell me everything, please, for one never knows when the smallest detail may not be important." His companion marshaled his thoughts. "My name is Reginald Alexander Montague James Bramfield Tregennis Shipton Bellinger, 5th Earl of Brangbolton. And on the 16th of the present month, today, in fact, I journeyed to the house of my friend Sir Sutton Hartley Westbing, bought. Here, in short, with the purpose of spending the week end there, knowing that Sir Sutton likes to have his guests sweet and fresh about the place, I decided to take a bath after dinner. I unpacked my soap, and in short space of time had lathered myself thoroughly from the neck upwards, and then, just as I was about to get at my right leg, what should I find but the soap had disappeared. Nasty shock it gave me, I can tell you.
Adrian had listened to this narrative with the closest attention. Certainly the problem appeared to present itself points of interest. "It looks like an inside job," he said thoughtfully. "It could scarcely be the work of a gang. You would have noticed a gang. Now just give me the facts briefly once again, if you please."
"Well, I was here, in the bath, as it might be, and the soap was here, between my hands, as it were. Next moment it was gone."
"Are you sure you have omitted nothing?"
Lord Brangbolton reflected. "Well, I was singing, of course."
A tense look came across Adrian's face. "Singing what?"
"Sonny Boy."
Adrian's face cleared. "As I suspected," he said with satisfaction. "Precisely as I had supposed. I wonder if you are aware, Lord Brangbolton, that in the singing of that particular song the muscles unconsciously contract as you came to the final boy. Thus, I still have you, Sonny Boy, you observe. It would be impossible for anyone rendering the number with the proper gusto not to force his hands together at this point, assuming that they were in anything like close juxtaposition. And if there were a slippery object between them, such as a piece of soap, it would inevitably shoot sharply upwards and fall." He scanned the room keenly, and outside the bath on the mat, as indeed, he concluded, picking up the missing object and restoring it to the proprietor. As indeed it did fall. Lord Brangbolton gaped. "Well, dash my buttons if that isn't the smartest bit of work I have seen in a month of Sundays." "Elementary," said Adrian with a shrug. You ought to be a detective." Adrian took the cue. "I am a detective,"
he said. "My name is Mulliner." And for an instant the words did not appear to have made any impression. The aged peer continued to beam through the soapsuds, and then suddenly his geniality vanished with an ominous swiftness. "Mulliner? Did you say Mulliner?" "I did." "You aren't by any chance the fellow who loves your daughter, Millicent, with a fervour he cannot begin to express?" "Oh, yes, Lord Bolton, I am, and I'm hoping that I may receive your consent to the match." A hideous scowl had darkened the Earl's brow. His fingers, which were grasping a loofah, tightly convulsed. "Oh, you are you? You imagine, do you, that I propose to welcome a blighted footprint and cigar-ash inspector into my family? Is it your idea, is it, that I shall acquiesce in the union of my daughter to a dashed fellow who goes about the place on his hands and knees with a magnifying glass, picking up small objects and putting them carefully away in his pocket? I seem to see myself. Why, rather than permit Millicent to marry a bully detective?" "What is your objection to detectives?" "Oh, never you mind what's my objection to detectives. Marry my daughter, indeed. I like your infernal cheek. Why, you couldn't keep her in lipsticks." Adrian preserved his dignity. "Well, I admit my services are not so amply remunerated as I could wish, but the firm hint of a rise next Christmas—" "Tch," said Lord Bolton. "Pshaw! If you're interested in my daughter's matrimonial arrangements, she's going, as soon as she gets through with this Brahma-Yamha gold mines flotation of his, to marry my old friend Jasper Addleton. And as for you, Mr. Mulliner, I have only 2 words to say to you. One is pop, and the other is off, and do it now." Adrian sighed. He saw that it would be hopeless to endeavor to argue with the haughty old man in his present mood. "So be it, Lord Bolton." And affecting not to notice the nail-brush, which struck him smartly at the back of the head, he left the room. The food and the drink provided by his guests, by Sir Sutton Hurtley Wesping at the dinner, which began some half-hour later, were all that the veriest gourmet could have desired, but Adrian gulped them down, scarcely tasting them. His whole attention was riveted on Sir Jasper Addleton, who sat immediately opposite him. And the more he examined Sir Jasper, the more revolting seemed the idea of his marrying the girl he loved. Of course, an ardent young fellow inspecting a man who's going to marry the girl he loves is always a stern critic. In the peculiar circumstances, Adrian would no doubt have looked askance at a Clark Gable or a Laurence Olivier, but in the case of Sir Jasper, it must be admitted that he had quite reasonably grounds for his disapproval. In the first place, there was enough of the financier to make 2 financiers. It was as if nature, planning a financier, had said to itself, "We will do this thing well. We will not skimp," with the result that becoming too enthusiastic, it could have been overdone. And then, in addition to being fat, he was also bald and goggle-eyed. And if you overlooked his baldness and the goggle protuberance of his eyes, you could not get away from the fact that he was well advanced in years. Such a man, felt Adrian, would have been better employed in pricing burial lots in Kensal Green Cemetery than in forcing his unwelcome attentions on a sweet young girl like Millicent. And as soon as the meal was concluded, he approached him with cold abhorrence. "A word with you," he said, and led him out onto the terrace. The OBE, as he followed him into the cool night air, seemed surprised and a little uneasy, He'd noticed that Adrian's scrutinizing him closely across the table, and if there's one thing a financier who has just put out a prospectus of a gold mine dislikes, it is to be scrutinized closely. What do you want?" he asked nervously. Adrian gave him a cold glance. "Do you ever look in a mirror, Sir Jasper?" he asked curtly. "Frequently," replied the financier, puzzled. "Do you ever weigh yourself?" "Often." "Do you ever listen when your tailor is toiling round you with the tape measure and calling out the score to his assistant?" "I do." "Then, and I speak in the kindest spirit of disinterested friendship, you must have realized that you are an overfed old bohunkus. And how you ever got the idea that you are a fit mate for Lady Millicent Shipton Bellinger frankly beats me. Surely it must have occurred to you what a priceless ass you will look, walking up the aisle with the young and lovely girl at your side. People will mistake you for an elderly uncle taking his niece to the zoo." The OBE bridled. "Ho," he said. "It is no use saying ho," said Adrian. "You can't get out of it with any hoes. When all the talk and argument have died away, the fact remains that, millionaire though you be, you are a nasty-looking, fat, senile millionaire, and if I were you, I should give the whole thing a miss. What do you want to get married for anyway? You're much happier as you are. Besides, think of the risks of a financier's life. Nice it would be for that sweet girl suddenly to get a wire from you telling her not to wait dinner for you, as you had just started a 7-year stretch at Dartmoor." An angry retort had been trembling on Sir Jasper's lips during the early portion of this speech, but at these concluding words it died unspoken. He blanched visibly and stared at the speaker with undisguised apprehensions. What do you mean?" "Never mind," said Adrian. He'd spoken, of course, purely at a venture, basing his remarks on the fact that nearly all OBEs who dabble in high finance go to prison sooner or later. Of Sir Jasper's actual affairs he knew nothing. "Hey, listen," said the financier, but Adrian did not hear him. I have mentioned that during dinner, preoccupied with his thoughts, he had bolted his food. Nature now took its toll. An acute spasm suddenly ran through him, and with a brief ouch of pain, he doubled up and began to walk around in circles. Sir Jasper clicked his tongue impatiently. "This is no time for doing the austere pom-pom dance," he said sharply. "Tell me what you mean by that stuff you were talking about, prison." Adrian had straightened himself, and in the light of the moon, which flooded the terrace with its silvery beams, his clean-cut face was plainly visible. And with a shiver of apprehension, Sir Jasper saw that it was a sardonic, sinister smile, a smile which it struck him was virtually tantamount to a leer. I have spoken of the dislike financiers have for being scrutinized closely. Still more vehemently do they object to being leered at. Sir Jasper reeled and was about to press his question when Adrian, still smiling, tottered off into the shadows and was lost to sight. The financier hurried into the smoking room where he knew there would be the materials for a stiff drink. A stiff drink was what he felt an imperious need for at the moment. He tried to tell himself that that smile could not really have had the inner meaning which he had read into it, but he was still quivering nervously as he entered the smoking room, and as he opened the door, the sound of an angry voice smote his ears. He recognized it as Lord Brangbolton's. "I call it dashed low," his lordship was saying in his high-pitched tenor. Sir Jasper gazed in bewilderment. His host, Sir Sutton Hartley Westbing, was standing backed against the wall, and Lord Bolton, tapping him on the shirt front with a piston-like forefinger, was plainly in the process of giving him a thorough ticking off. "What's the matter?" said the financier. "I'll tell you what's the matter," cried Lord Bolton. "This hound here, he's got a detective to watch his guests, a dashed fellow named Mulliner. So much for our boasted English hospitality. Egad," he went on, still tapping the baronet round and about the diamond solitaire, "I call it thoroughly low. If I have a few of my society chums down to my little place for a visit, naturally I chain up the hairbrushes, and I tell the butler to count the spoons every night. But I never dream of going so far as to employ beastly detectives. One has one's code. Noblesse, I mean to say, oblige. What? But listen, please," said the baronet. "I keep telling you I had to invite this fellow here. I thought that if he'd eaten my bread and salt, he would not expose me." "What do you mean, expose you?" Sir Sutton coughed. "Oh, it was nothing, the merest trifle. Still, the man undoubtedly could have made things unpleasant for me if he'd wished. Sir, when I looked up and saw him smiling at me in this frightful, sardonic, knowing way—" Sir Jasper Addleton uttered a sharp cry. "Smiling? Did you say smiling?" "Smiling," said the baronet. "It was one of those smiles that seems to go right through you and light up all your inner being, as if it was a searchlight." Sir Jasper gulped again. "Is this similar fellow, is he tall, dark, thin chap?" "That's right. He sat opposite you at dinner." "And he's a detective?" "He is," said Lord Bolton, "as shrewd and smart a detective as I've ever met in my life. The way he found that soap. Fellow struck me as having some sort of a sixth sense, if you know what I mean. Dash and curse him. I hate detectives. Oh, they give me the creeps. This one wants to marry my daughter Millicent, of all the dashed nerve." "See you later," said Jasper, and with a single bound he was out of the room and on his way to the terrace. And there was, he felt, no time to waste. His florid face, as he galloped along, was twisted and ashen. With one hand he drew from his inside pocket a cheque-book, with the other from his trouser pocket a fountain pen. Adrian, when the financier found him, was feeling a good deal better. He blessed the day when he'd sought the specialist's advice. And there was no doubt about it. He felt the man knew his business. Smiling might make the cheek muscles ache, but it undoubtedly did the trick as regarded the pangs of dyspepsia. And for a brief while before Sir Jasper burst into the terrace, waving fountain pen and cheque-book, Adrian had been giving his face a rest. But now, the pain in his cheeks having abated, he deemed it prudent to resume the treatment, and so it came about that the financier, hurrying toward him, was met with a smile so meaning, so suggestive, that he stopped on his tracks and for a moment could not speak. "Oh, you there," he said, recovering at length. "Might I have a word with you in private, Mr. Mulliner?" Adrian nodded, beaming. The financier took him by the coat sleeve and led him across the terrace. He was breathing a little stertorously. "Well, I've been thinking things over," he said, "and I've come to the conclusion that you were right." "Right?" said Adrian. "About my marrying. It wouldn't do." "No? Oh, positively not. Absurd. I can see it now. I'm too old, too fat for the girl." "Oh, yes. Too bald. Exactly. Oh, and too fat." "Oh, much too fat," agreed Adrian. The sudden change of heart puzzled him, but none the less the other's words were as music to his ears. Every syllable the OBE had spoken had caused his heart to leap within him like a young lamb in springtime, and his mouth curved in a smile. Sir Jasper, seeing it, shied like a frightened horse. He patted Adrian's arm fervently. "So, I've decided," he said, "to take your advice and, Well, if I recall your expression, give the thing I miss. You couldn't do better, said Adrian heartily. Now, if I were to remain in England in these circumstances, proceeded Sir Jasper, there might be unpleasantness, so I propose to go quietly away at once to some remote spot, say, South America. Now, don't you think I'm right, he said, giving the cheekbone a twitch. Quite right, said Adrian. You won't mention this little plan of mine to anyone? You will keep it as just a secret between ourselves? I, for instance, any of your cronies at Scotland Yard should express, or if, for instance, any of your cronies at Scotland Yard should express curiosity as to where my whereabouts are, you will plead ignorance? Certainly. Oh, capital, said Jasper, relieved. And there is one thing that I gather from Brangholton, that you are anxious to marry Lady Millicent yourself, and as by the time of the wedding I shall doubtless be in, Callao, in a spot that suggests itself offhand, I would like to give you my little wedding present now. He scribbled hastily in his checkbook, tore out a page, and handed it to Adrian. Remember, he said, not a word to anyone. Quite, said Adrian. He watched the financier disappear in the direction of the garage, regretting that he could have misjudged the man who so evidently had much good in him. Presently, the sound of a motor engine announced that the other was on his way. Feeling that one obstacle, at least between himself and his happiness, had been removed, Adrian strolled indoors to see what the rest of the party was doing. It was a quiet, peaceful scene that met his eyes as he wandered into the library, overruling the request of some of the members of the company for a rubber of bridge. Lord Brangbolton had gathered them together at a small table and was initiating them into his favorite game of Persian monarchs. It's perfectly simple, dash it. You just take the pack and cut. You bet, let us say, £10, then you will cut a higher card than the feller you're cutting against. And if you do, you win, dash it. And if you don't, the other dash feller wins. Quite clear, what? They settled down to their game, and Adrian wandered about the room, endeavored to still the riot of emotion which his recent interview with Sir Jasper Attleton had aroused in his bosom. All that remained for him to do now, he reflected, was by some means or other to remove the existing prejudice against him from Lord Brangbolton's mind. It would not be easy, of course. To begin with, there was the matter of his straitened means. He suddenly remembered that he had not yet looked at the cheque which the financier had handed him. He pulled it out of his pocket, and having glanced at it, Adrian Mulliner swayed like a poplar in a storm. Just what he had expected, he could not have said. A fiver, possibly, at the most a tenner. Just a trifling gift, he had imagined, and which to buy himself a cigarette lighter, a fish slice, or an egg boiler. Well, the cheque was for £100,000. So great was the shock that as Adrian caught sight of himself in the mirror opposite to which he was standing, he scarcely recognized the face in the glass. He seemed to be seeing it through a mist, and then the mist cleared, and he saw not only his face clearly, but also that of Lord Brangbolton, who was in the act of cutting against his left-hand neighbour, Lord Nubble of Knop. And as he thought of the effect this sudden ascension of wealth must surely have on the father of the girl he loved, there came into Adrian's face a sudden, swift smile, and simultaneously from behind him he heard a gasping exclamation, and looking in the mirror he met Lord Brangbolton's eyes. Always a little prominent, they were now almost prawn-like in their convexity. Lord Nubble of Knop had produced a banknote from his pocket and was pushing it along the table. "Another ace," he exclaimed. "Well, I'll be dashed." Lord Brangbolton had risen from his chair. "Excuse me," he said in a strange, croaking voice. I I just want to have a little chat with my friend, my dear old Mr. Mulliner here. Might I have a word in private with you, Mr. Mulliner?" There was a silence between the two men until they reached the corner of the terrace, out of earshot of the library window. Then Lord Brangbolton cleared his throat. "Mulliner? Or rather, what is your Christian name?" "Adrian." "Adrian, my dear fellow. My memory is not what it should be, but I seem to have a distant recollection that when I was in my bath before dinner you said something about wanting to marry my daughter Millicent." "I did. And if your objections to me as a suitor were merely financial, well, let me assure you that since we last spoke I have become a wealthy man." "Oh, I never had any objections to you, Adrian, financial or otherwise," said Lord Brangbolton, patting his arm affectionately. "I've always felt that the man my daughter married ought to be a fine, warm-hearted young fellow like you. For you, Adrian," he proceeded, "are essentially warm-hearted. You would never dream of distressing a father-in-law by mentioning any little. In short, I say, from your smile in there, that you had noticed that I was introducing into that game of blonde hookey, or rather Persian monarchs, certain little, well, shall I say, variations, destined to give it additional interest and excitement. Well, and I feel sure that you would scorn to embarrass a father-in-law by, well, to cut a long story short, my boy, take Millicent, and with her father's blessings." He extended his hand. Adrian clasped it warmly. "I'm the happiest man in the world," he said, smiling. Lord Brangbolton winced. "Oh, do you mind not doing that?" he said. "Well, I only smiled," said Adrian. "Oh, I know," said Lord Brangbolton. Well, little remains to be told. Adrian and Millicent were married 3 months later at a fashionable West End church. All society was there. The presents were both numerous and costly, and the bride looked charming. The service was conducted by the very Reverend the Dean of Bittlesham. Well, it was in the vestry afterwards, as Adrian looked at Millicent and seemed to realize for the first time that all his troubles were over, and that this lovely girl was indeed his, for better or worse, that a fond sense of his happiness swept over the young man. And all through the ceremony he had been grave, as befitted a man at the most serious point of his career, but now, fizzing as it were some spiritual yeast, he clasped her in his arms, and over his shoulder his face broke into a quick smile, and he found himself looking into the eyes of the Dean of Bittlesham. And a moment later he felt a tap on his arm. "Might I have a word with you in private, Mr. Mulliner?" said the Dean in a low voice. Well, we're going to end now with... do we have time? We've got, how long is the philosopher? 6 minutes? Oh, okay. Well, then we're just going to end with one song, and it's Napoli. And this is Swami singing it, and it's just a cheerful song. Unfortunately, we didn't get the English version. We just have the Italian version, but you'll feel Swami's heart very much alive in it. And I'll just read the first verse. "When you come to Napoli, la 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 la, life is long and joy is free." And then he goes on to sing the other verses in Italian. So enjoy. And God bless you. Have a pleasant evening.
Sono qui da Napoli, la 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 la, cantano con gioia lì, la 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 la, la 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 la, la 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 la. La 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 la. Con Ogni sguardo, ogni fior, la 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 la, lei ci parla dell'amor, la 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 la. La 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 la. La 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 la. Canta anche tu con me, la 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 la, manda i guai lontano da te, la 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 la. La 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 la. La 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 la. When you come from Napoli, la 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 la, life is long and joy is free, la 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 la. La 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 la. La 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 la. Can't you hear this music say la 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 la? Dance your troubles all away, la 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 la. La 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 la. La 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 la. La 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 la. La 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 la. Sono qui da Napoli, la 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 la. Cantano con gioia lì, la 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 la. La 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 la. La 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 la. La 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 la. La 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 la. Ogni sguardo, ogni fior, la 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 la, lì ci parla dell'amor, la 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 la. La 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 la. La 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 la. Canta anche tu con me, la 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 la, manda i guai lontano da te, la 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 la. La 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 la. La 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 la. La 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 la. La 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 la.